Namaste. So when I was in high school, I had a communications teacher named Craig Bergland. And it's probably about the only classroom content I really remember was from his classes, and I took everything he taught. And one day he went up to the chalkboard and he drew a box or a square, and in the square he wrote, "Every statement in this square is false." Which of course is paradox. And I remember sitting there, well, I still remember it, so I still must think about it on some level. Because, of course, if it's false, then it must be true, except that it says that it's false.
Making a false statement.
Right. And I think it's a great metaphor for the spiritual life. Because when you can't tolerate a little bit of paradox, or a lot of bit of paradox, then you're reduced to fundamentalism. Then you're reduced to literalism. Then you're like Pastor Dan. I met Pastor Dan this week while I was out working. Hi, I'm Pastor Dan from, I don't know what church, I couldn't understand. Can I ask you a question? And against my better judgment, I said, yes. My usual response is, you just did. There's a limit to one to a customer. Did I have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? Did I know what it was to be born again? He wasn't very happy with my answer, but he didn't understand the box. So he had to reduce everything to literal. And when I suggested he return to his Bible and read it again, I'm sure it flew over his head. But we have paradox in this business about the steward. And we also have issues of what the Buddhists call right livelihood. What you need to know to understand the story, the parable, is that most of the biblical world worked on commission. It was all straight commission work. The tax collector was a straight commission employee. The tax collector had to get so much tax out of it. Let's just say it's $100 to bring it to contemporary terms. If he only got $100 from you, he didn't make it. So he would tell you, that'll be $120. That's what your tax is. And he'd keep the 20 and send the 100 to the people who he was responsible to. Stewards, dealing with their household master's accounts, worked on commission. If he sold you $100 worth of goods, he'd charge you $120. Now in actuality, sometimes he'd charge you $200, $300, $400, whatever he could get out of you. But to keep it simple, he'd charge you $120. The master got $100, the steward got $20. So first of all, we know the steward was not Marvin Gaye because he was too proud to beg. I'll take it. Secondly, we could say he was sort of like the first debt collector. He was, offering to settle for a lesser amount just to get paid. But what he really was probably doing was sacrificing his commission to get his master paid. So he was, first of all, making friendly with the people who owed his master money, because from their perspective, they were getting a discount. He was making his master happy, because as far as his master was concerned, he still got the full amount. Unlike a debt collector, the master was not getting a reduced amount in return for selling the debt to the agency. And that explains why the master said, gee, here's a good thing. It explains why Jesus seems to be saying, gee, here's a good thing. Because in a very real way, the only one who lost was the servant, or the steward rather. And the only reason he lost was because he hadn't been doing a very good job keeping track of his master's accounts. What got him in trouble was probably not collecting what was due his master in the first place. Being kind of lackadaisical. He didn't really want to be the debtor. He didn't want to call people up and, not that he could, head on over to their tent and harass them for the master's money. So, or he could have been lazy, we don't really know. But if you look at the story that way, then you get around this problem where it sounds like Jesus is saying, yeah, go ahead and cheat people. Yeah, if you get in trouble, do what you need to do to be friends with the people around you, because that'll be good for you when you're looking to come into the kingdom. And we should leave open what that means. In a way, the steward is doing the best he can to make things right, and is hoping that, in contemporary terms, his master will give him a good letter of reference, or the people that perceive him as having given him this discount may recommend him to somebody. He's trying to negotiate his future, and he is being shrewd about it. And there's nothing wrong with being shrewd. In fact, sometimes spiritual folks of every stripe don a sort of voluntary naivete. I used to call it spiritual self-lobotomy. And we've all probably seen the type. They're just happy. Happy Christians a lot. Because they just love Jesus. And you almost get the impression that you could walk up and hit them right between the eyes with a tire iron, and they'd still smile at you and say, Jesus loves you. And while it might be tempting, really, really tempting, I'd have had one. Pastor Dan might have caught one right here. It's, first of all, not real. What happens when you really believe that if you're a good person, nothing bad should ever happen to you? You come to a place like the steward came to, where either you have to say, because I promise you, something bad will happen sooner or later. So now either you have to say, I'm not a good person, or you have to say, God has let me down. But suppose that God isn't a snowplow. Suppose that God's job is not to sort of become attached to the front of us and clear the way of obstacles. Suppose instead that bumper sticker that really was annoying that said, Jesus is my co-pilot. Suppose there is some shred of truth to that, in that God's job is not to be a snowplow, but to sit next to you. That God accompanies us. Aaron and I went to see Sully last night. The movie, the Tom Hanks movie that just came out about Sully Sullenberger, who you may remember was the pilot who landed a U.S. airplane on the Hudson River, and all 155 people on board survived. And the critical reviews have been mixed, including the critical reviews that come from Aaron and me. But I want to say I loved every minute of it. The critics think sometimes they focus on the same thing too much. But the focus of the movie is not just the crash, but also the fact that after the crash, the NTSB basically tried to hang Sully Sullenberger out to dry. And tried to cast it so that he was responsible for this crash, and that he in fact could have made it back to Milwaukee. And the thing that, the thing about the movie, the first officer, his co-pilot, who has a smashing 70s porn mustache, watching the two of them work in the cockpit as these geese, you may not remember, there were a flock of geese literally flew into the airplane and were sucked into the engines, as jet engines would do, and shredded them. And they lost all thrust. And as they tried to restart the plane, the engines, and they couldn't because they were hurling a goose through what is essentially a large fan, not only messes up the goose, but it kind of dirties up the fan too, and cracks off pieces of blades, and so they couldn't start the plane. But, and while I'm not saying either of these guys were God, it was very interesting because I had forgotten that quite often in commercial airliners, it is the co-pilot, the first officer, who does the taking off and the landing. And the pilot is there when there was trouble. But when the trouble ensued and it became clear that they were gonna have to ditch the plane, then the captain took back over. But at the same time, the co-pilot was still there, checking other things. There's a book, apparently, they pull out and look to make sure that they're covering every possibility to get the engines restarted. I think this is a much better metaphor for looking at how God functions. If you don't want, and the reason you wouldn't want it is because you've discovered it just isn't the case. If you don't want God as cosmic chess player moving us about, or you don't want God as snowplow, then God as companion becomes a better metaphor. Now you have to sacrifice this belief that if I just smile enough and I'm happy about Jesus, nothing bad will happen. But I'm here to say you're going to sacrifice that belief no matter what, unless you're going to live in this world of massive denial. And you also then get a God who's much more nuanced, a God who's more subtle, a God who can say, you know what, you screwed up, but you sacrificed your commission and made some deals and got yourself back in good standing with the people around you that you need to continue your life and your economic situation. And that's not a bad thing. We get uncomfortable with it because then there are no sure and certain answers. Life becomes much less black and white and much more gray. But isn't that what life is? There are very few things that are absolutely always good or the right response. I can even say that about telling the truth. I remember my ethics professor at Marquette, who was kind of an odd bird, but philosophers are, saying that would you agree that it's a good value to tell the truth? We all said, oh yeah. So you're working as a clerk in a store and a woman runs in and says, help me, help me. A man is chasing me with a knife and trying to kill me. And you say, hide behind the counter. Right behind her, a man runs in with a knife and says, have you seen a woman running this way? Do you step back and go, oh yeah, she's right down here. Well, of course not. But knowing that shows that life is great. That a God who just says, here's what it is, too bad, do it or fail, do it or I won't love you, do it or I won't care about you, do it or I won't protect you, is nothing more than a projection of an abusive parent onto God. Sadly, the world is full of those projections. But when we start to look across traditions, our projections get challenged because the assumptions about life and about human beings in other traditions are different assumptions quite often, particularly when they're from the East. Where the West tends to say people are bad and jacked up. People in the East tend to say people are good and make mistakes. And so one of the advantages of practicing in other traditions, or at least looking at other traditions, is we start to develop a much more three-dimensional concept of God. Now, institutional religion probably doesn't like that because it's harder to keep you in the corral once that happens. But nevertheless, if what we're after is a spirituality that can function for us, that can actually help us, I don't think there's any way to avoid doing it.
Okay.